Hiya, and welcome to video number 2 in our short Tempest revision series. Our focus today is on Miranda and Ferdinand. So I did a video last week about Ariel and Caliban, in which I kind of went through, hopefully, a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of how we might prepare and revise. We talked about the things you might say about Miranda and Ferdinand and how you might use them in your arguments. We brought in some critics. We thought about kind of looking at some close analysis. We thought then about context, and then I gave you a little thing to go and do. So I'm going to structure this video in the same way that I structured the Ariel and Caliban video. And because last week's video was close to that half-hour mark, I'll get started straight away in the hope that I can shave some time off for you. So last time, I think we started by thinking about the play's big themes and then thinking about how our two characters in question might start to help you build arguments. So I've done the same thing again. I've even done it in the same colours. So we've got Miranda and Ferdinand. I think the most obvious thing is if you get a question about love, which is very possible, then this is the central romance of the play, isn't it? You can't really write an essay about love, about the Tempest, without mentioning these two. And I think in terms of the way we studied it, in terms of a useful way to look at it, is I think there's two key ways of looking at Miranda and Ferdinand's relationship in terms of love. And I think the first way is to look at it kind of straight on as a story that's genuinely about romance and innocence. So if you wanted to agree with a slightly old-fashioned critic like Alfred Bates, Alfred Bates there is just saying the history of the loves of Ferdinand and Miranda developed in a few short scenes is enchantingly beautiful. And I think we'll come to ways in which you might challenge that, but I think you've got to engage with the idea that some people might find it that. You know, you've got Act 1, Scene 2, their first meeting, in which both of them are awkward and naive, aren't they? So if you remember in Act 1, Scene 2, Miranda is kind of immediately up front, isn't she? She says what a brave form he has, and she kind of can't stop kind of commenting on him and looking at him. On the other hand, you know, he's thinking that she's the goddess of the island. So their first meeting is a kind of love at first sight first meeting that is kind of two naive youngsters maybe falling in love for the first time. So the things that appealed to audiences about Romeo and Juliet, for example, in Shakespeare, are, I guess, the same things that are appealing here. They are the two more innocent characters of the play, and it's not a coincidence, is it, that neither of them are involved in the intrigue that the generation above them are involved in, like their two fathers, and both of them just have this quite innocent meeting. Then you've got their courtship, which is, you know, them falling in love with each other as he carries the logs for her father, and again they're both quite endearingly awkward, aren't they? So there's Ferdinand trying to impress her by telling her that he's seen all these other girls and they were all rubbish compared to her. You so perfect and so peerless. And her just forgetting everything that her father told her about, kind of, you know, playing hard to get. Her kneeling and proposing to him. All of those things where the sweetness in their relationship comes from their naivety and their slight awkwardness, and probably also from Miranda's total lack of understanding of accepted gender roles in her behaviour, in terms of like the way you might attract a male partner. So definitely an argument that you could make is the Alfred Bates one, which is their story is just nice. Um, in an essay, we might also want to challenge that, and I think moving on from love and romance, although it's definitely related, you could definitely use these two as an argument about power, things like power and freedom and restriction. We talked about that a lot with Ariel and Caliban, but I think a feminist interpretation would tell us that Miranda also is in a cage here, isn't she? A gendered cage. So she's a pawn in Prospero's plans, and she's an object to be gifted from one man to another. So I think if you look at Act 1, Scene 2, we see all of Prospero's asides during their courtship. So even though their courtship is, as Alfred Bates says, sweet and innocent and charming and beautiful, we also see Prospero being the puppet master of it. And in Act 4, Scene 1, you've got all of that language where they're talking about Prospero ratifies his rich gift, doesn't he? And Prospero bargains with Ferdinand, and Prospero is really preoccupied with her virginity and him keeping her virginity intact before the wedding and all of that. So there is this darker undertone to their relationship to do with Prospero's need to control everything, which in a bigger sense is to do with patriarchy's need to control women. Lilla Grindley is really useful here with that one. Prospero describes Miranda as a prize. It objectifies her as his property and assigns value to her. She herself knows this because she refers to her modesty as the jewel in my dower. So even though Prospero hasn't taught her how to behave, he's definitely taught her that her virginity is of value and is maybe her main value. And we'll talk in a little while about the femme covert, which is an AO3 thing that Lilla Grindley mentions. So I think that complicating your view of Miranda and Ferdinand and their relationship is going to be definitely useful. I'm just looking at time. Okay. Thirdly, I think in a wider sense, forgiveness and reconciliation. If you get a question about reconciliation and about the end of the play, then Ferdinand and Miranda are really key to Prospero's reconciliation and forgiveness. So a way I thought of putting it, if Ariel is the catalyst for Prospero's forgiveness, then Miranda and Ferdinand are the embodiment of it. So in Act 5, Scene 1, as he forgives the nobles, he also then gifts Alonso back his son, and he gifts everybody a new happy marriage. And they become this embodiment of a hopeful future, don't they, which was Prospero's plan all along and why he wanted to put them together. So Prospero's big reveal of Miranda and Ferdinand turns both of them into this embodiment of Prospero's forgiveness and Prospero's hope for the future, turning away from revenge, and kind of creating this kind of sense of renewal. I put Keith Linley's thing here. Ferdinand is a counterbalance of continence to Caliban's lust. Like Miranda, Ferdinand represents a theological concept of man in a state of primal prelapsarian innocence. Neither is tainted by the corruption around them. So if you wanted to talk about reconciliation, you could talk about how what's required for Prospero is these two who are representative of this idea of like a new, fresh, renewed start. Prelapsarian is a word that Linley uses. It means prelapsarian refers to Adam and Eve and the fall of man and original sin, and prelapsarian means before the fall. So like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before they sinned, in this kind of state of innocence. That's what Miranda and Ferdinand kind of symbolically are at the end of this play. So you'd look at that. And then I think lastly, just a really simple thing, I was trying to think of other sorts of questions. Magic and spectacle. Well, we talked about magic and spectacle with Ariel, and I think Ariel would probably be your main focus if that question came up. But you could definitely talk about the mask if you wanted to talk about magic and spectacle in this play. The fact that most of Act 4 is taken up with this spurious kind of mask, which doesn't really make much sense in the play and can lift straight out of it without affecting the storyline. Their wedding is an excuse, isn't it, for spectacle and for Shakespeare to put in this celebration, this slightly nonsensical mask. So those are things that you would talk about there. So we've been through maybe some AO1 and AO5 and some of the ways in which we might build arguments using Miranda and Ferdinand. I thought I'd give maybe one example of how we might do this. So just editing as I go along on the video there. I thought I'd just show you just very quickly. Here's an extract from Act 1, Scene 2. I accidentally typed Ariel there earlier, but it's Miranda and Prospero. And this is Miranda's first view of Ferdinand, and this is Ferdinand's first view of her. So I think in terms of patterns in imagery, if you got an extract like this, you'd want to be looking at kind of love at first sight, wouldn't you? And the way Miranda is presented. Miranda's innocence is immediately established at the beginning of this here, where, believe me, sir, what is it, a spirit, Lord, how it looks about? Believe me, sir, it carries a brave form. but 'tis a spirit. Her naivety there is coming across in those lines. She sees Ferdinand and she immediately says he's too beautiful to be a person, he must be a spirit. And Prospero then has to explain, no, he eats and sleeps and has such senses as we have. Miranda says, I might call him a thing divine, for nothing natural I ever saw so noble. So again, we've got this kind of imagery of divinity that Miranda is using when she sees Ferdinand, for Shakespeare to convey that quite sweet kind of immediate love at first sight. But when she says it carries a brave form, I guess we've also got Miranda not really understanding the appropriate ways in which a young woman might talk about a young man at that time. She comments on how good looking he is. A brave form means he looks good, right? So she doesn't understand that she probably needs to keep those things a little bit more wrapped up and quiet, and that again might be seen as endearing. You've got Prospero's aside there in the middle of that extract. It goes on, I see as my soul prompts it. So if you wanted to make the argument about Prospero really being in control, there's loads of asides in these scenes where we see Prospero basically commentating on what's going on. And then Ferdinand completes the loop of this divine imagery that Shakespeare's using, because she says he is a thing divine, he's a spirit, he's a brave form. He says she's a goddess, she's the goddess on whom these heirs attend. So these two are kind of linked together through their language and imagery, aren't they? They both see each other as divine creatures, which is conveying this idea of the love at first sight. But again, if we wanted to take that feminist interpretation, we might have a look at the first question that Ferdinand asks her. So he says, oh, you wonder, which is a pun on her name, Miranda, isn't it? Because Miranda means miraculous and wonderful. So our Latin audience would have got Shakespeare's slightly lame joke. But the first question he asks, my prime request, if you be maid or no. And maid means virgin, maid means unmarried woman, and therefore virgin. So there are conditions. Ferdinand understands full well that there are social conventions and conditions, and he needs to examine those before he can go further. Miranda has no such knowledge, does she? So there's loads you could say, even in that very short bit, about all the things that I've just said earlier about, like, this is a balance between it being sweet and beautiful and endearing, but also then revealing things about gender and revealing things about control and power when we look at Prospero and Ferdinand. Last week I thought it might be quite useful if I just went through maybe some stagecraft stuff for you to revise or to think about. So last week with Caliban we talked about the logs. I think it's interesting that Shakespeare repurposes the image of the logs, and in Ferdinand's hands they become something different. So the logs, if you remember from last week, they were a visual symbol of Caliban's enslavement, but actually in Ferdinand's hands the logs become a symbol of his worthiness to have Miranda, right? Don't they? They become a symbol of his masculinity, a symbol of his ability to do the manly thing and carry the logs and go through this kind of little trial, so that at the end he gets the prize and the gift of Miranda. So it's interesting that with Caliban they're a symbol of enslavement, but with Ferdinand they're a symbol of his masculinity, and they're a symbol of his kind of willingness to go through these trials for her. That's also why when she offers to pick up the logs and she says, well, I do a better job than you anyway, that's why Ferdinand is so offended, isn't he? And he says, I'd rather crack my sinews and break my back than let you carry these logs, because they represent the price he's got to pay, and they represent his masculinity. So Miranda accidentally emasculates him because she doesn't understand the rules of gender. Then I thought about Shakespeare's use of Ferdinand's sword in Act 1, Scene 2. So Ferdinand draws his sword to try and escape from Prospero. Prospero uses his staff to kind of make the sword heavy, and it becomes a symbol of his total power, even his emasculation of Ferdinand. We don't have to go into loads of stuff on that, but you've got the kind of fairly crude phallic symbol there, haven't you, that Prospero's staff is much bigger and more powerful than Ferdinand's weak little sword, and that's why he has power over him. So you could definitely talk about that as kind of a symbol of his power. And I think something that's also worth looking at as a final piece of stagecraft is Miranda and Ferdinand are playing chess at the end when Prospero reveals them. It's quite an ambiguous one, I think, but I think that idea of chess being a game of strategy, a game of defeating your opponents by outwitting them. I think Prospero well, Shakespeare is using that as a metaphor for Prospero's strategic skill, perhaps. So Shakespeare's use of the game of chess there, I think, would also be worth talking about in terms of stagecraft. I feel like I'm rattling through this a little bit, and hopefully, because I've got more of a structure, the video should be shorter. So I mentioned to you last week, didn't I, or in the other video, that AO3 is really important here. AO3 is worth 20 marks in that 45 mark essay. So whenever you're talking about Miranda and Ferdinand, here are some of the things that you could then link to why they are the way they are. So I think we've got to look at the Renaissance Masque, that 1613 royal wedding performance. If this play was rewritten for the royal wedding in 1613, and therefore the play we have is that rewrite, then Shakespeare might have inserted the masque in Act 4 as a traditional nod to lavish elite celebrations with costume, music and dancing. Prospero might represent King James I, a father giving away his daughter, and Ferdinand and Miranda might represent the real-life Prince Frederick and Princess Elizabeth. That's why that masque doesn't make sense in terms of the play, and it lifts right out of the play. The play would be kind of the same if it wasn't there, because really Miranda and Ferdinand briefly become this metaphor for like all young couples celebrating their wedding. So that's a point you could make about the masque there. Okay. Next, Lilla Grinley mentions this in your critics. But it's worth also thinking, if you're going to be taking that feminist interpretation, then it's worth backing up that feminist interpretation with that point about how the law was literally different in 1613. The legal status of married women in Jacobean era is one of total control. Young women were legally possessions of their fathers to be signed over to their husbands. This was especially true of upper class, where money, property and titles were involved. And I suppose if you were a noble man or a kind of a king, then the daughter that you had would be kind of the same legal status as your title and your money and your property, all things to be kind of safeguarded and handed over using, very specific legal documentation. And so the woman was just kind of part of that marriage as a contract between two men, contract between a father and a husband. Fathers and daughters in Shakespeare, there's that really good article by Barbara Bleeman in your booklet in the first year, which looks at Prospero and Miranda, and looks at the idea that Shakespeare is preoccupied with father-daughter relationships in his work. Shakespeare, I think he's in his mid-40s when he writes this play, and he's got a teenage daughter himself. But all the way through his career, he's interested in drama that is catalysed by disobedient daughters. So Romeo and Juliet is obviously the famous example of that, but there's loads of others, including in the comedies. So Prospero and Miranda exhibit some of the typical ideas around control, because Prospero, of course, does control her. But Prospero and Miranda are also unusual. I'd say it's hard to find a happier father-daughter relationship than these two in Shakespeare. Often father-daughter relationships are characterised by conflict. She remains obedient to him. I think that's a big part of why they get along, isn't it? But also he seems to afford her more power than fathers usually do, because he's educated her and he has control over that, doesn't he? So in some ways they are a typical father-daughter relationship because he controls her, but there are nuances there, and crucially, we don't get a disobedient daughter in The Tempest. We get a totally obedient daughter, and that ends happily, doesn't it? So maybe there's a bit of a reactionary message there from Shakespeare about, daughters obey your fathers. So, final thoughts is it's the same with the other video. So go through your booklet, look at all the possible past exam questions. Which specific exam questions now would allow you to build arguments about Ferdinand and Miranda? And go back through the video, go back through the things that I've said, and perhaps start to help. That might hopefully help you to build up those things. So I have done it quicker than last time, so I'm quite pleased with myself. I'm going to do an old-fashioned one this time. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.